I am rejoicing, singing his praises. Jesus is mine. In the bright sunlight, ever rejoicing, pressing my way to mansions above. Singing his praises, gladly I'm walking, walking in sunlight, sunlight of love. Heavenly sunlight, flooding my soul with glory divine. Hallelujah, I am rejoicing, singing his praises. Jesus is mine.
So let's continue with Genesis. In Egypt, but not of Egypt. Let's read together. So Israel set out with all that was his, and when he reached Beersheba, he offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. And God spoke to Israel in a vision that night and said, Jacob, Jacob. Here am I, he replied. I am God, the God of your father, he said. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you into a great nation there. I will go down to Egypt with you, and I will surely bring you back again. And Joseph's own hands will close your eyes. Then Jacob left Beersheba, and Israel's sons took their father and Jacob with their children and their wives with the carts that Pharaoh had sent them to transport him. They also took with them their livestock and their possessions that they had acquired in Canaan. And Jacob and all of his offspring went to Egypt. Now Jacob sent Judah ahead of him to Joseph to get directions to Goshen. When they arrived in the region of Goshen, Joseph had his chariot made ready and went to Goshen to meet his father Israel. As soon as Joseph appeared before him, he threw his arms around his father, and they wept for a long time. Israel said to Joseph, Now I am ready to die, since I have seen for myself that you are still alive. You can imagine the scene. Jacob's mourned the loss of his son for over 20 years. Thought he was dead. Thought he was torn apart by animals. Only to find out that he's not only alive, but he's in charge of the strongest nation in existence at that time. That had to be a mind-blowing experience. He was facing death with deep mourning in his soul, and here's where I see a little messianic precursor, preview. You see, when he saw that the one who was dead is alive, he was ready to meet death with hope for the future. We get a little glimpse, a little Messiah thing coming in here. That Jacob, when he saw his son, said, Now I'm ready to die. I'm okay with death now, because the one I thought was dead is alive. Continue on. Joseph went and told Pharaoh, My father and brothers, with their flocks and herds and everything they own, have come from the land of Canaan and are now in Goshen. He chose 5 of his brothers to present them to Pharaoh. Pharaoh asked the brothers, What is your occupation? Your servants are shepherds, they replied to Pharaoh, just as our fathers were. They also said to him, We have come to live here a while because the famine is severe in Canaan, and your servants' flocks have no pasture. So now please let your servants settle in Goshen, one of the best places for herds. Pharaoh said to Joseph, Your father and your brothers have come to you, and the land of Egypt is before you. Settle your father and your brothers in the best part of the land. Let them live in Goshen. And if you know of any among them who has special ability, put them in charge of my own livestock. Then Joseph brought his father Jacob in and presented him before Pharaoh. Jacob blessed Pharaoh, and Pharaoh asked him, How old are you? It's always a dangerous question, you know. And Jacob said to Pharaoh, The years of my pilgrimage are 130. My years have been few and difficult, and they do not equal the years of the pilgrimage of my fathers. Then Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from his presence. Now the Israelites settled in Egypt, in the region of Goshen. They acquired property there, and they were fruitful and increased greatly in number. Jacob lived in Egypt 17 years, and the years of his life were 147. When the time drew near for Israel to die, he called for his son Joseph and said, "If I have found favor in your eyes, put your hand under my thigh and promise that you will show me kindness and faithfulness. Do not bury me in Egypt. But when I rest with my fathers, carry me out of Egypt and bury me where they are buried." "I will do as you say," he said. "Swear to me," he said. Then Joseph swore to him, and Israel worshipped as he leaned on the top of his staff. Divine reassurance. Get this opening scene. They're getting ready to take off. They get to Beersheba, a place that he had worshipped before. He knows he's heading out of the country, not just out of his home. And God talks to him. And I always love this because you see this formula all through the Old Testament. Jacob, Jacob. When you hear the two names, it's serious, you know. And he says, "Here am I." Like, you know, when you're talking to God, here am I, just that he's everywhere. It's not like God didn't know where he was. But what it is, it's saying, "I'm yours. I'm your God. Here I am. What do you need? What can I do for you?" He says, "I'm the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt." And we've talked about this, that this is almost like a required training course in heaven. If you talk to humans, say, "Do not be afraid." And the reason is because we scare easily. And when we're talking to God, it's a frightening situation. So God just starts off with the formula, "Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt. For I will make you into a great nation there. I will go down to Egypt with you, and I will surely bring you back." Now that's critical. You may think you're just sort of reading a nice exchange between God and Jacob. But it's really important that he says, "I'm going with you, and I'm going to bring you back." That somehow you're not, leaving me when you go to Egypt. In Kenya, they used to joke, they love plays on words. And, when someone would be leaving, I would say, "Well, go with God." And they would turn around and say, "Well, if I go with him, then he won't be with you." And we need to understand that you don't, just because someone goes with God doesn't mean you're leaving God. And that's what he's saying here. Just because you're leaving Canaan doesn't mean you're leaving me. And this will play out even in the life of Moses. Jacob was well aware that he was the child of the promise. This promise had been passed down. And you remember all the intrigue between Jacob and Esau and all the getting the blessing and the birthright. And he's well aware of the promise that he has. He's talked with God before. And he knew that Canaan was the promised land. And so he might have been a little nervous about leaving the promised land, being a child of the promise. But this is where the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and now the God of Jacob lets Jacob know that the journey to Egypt is a round trip, not a one-way ticket. That when you go down there, you're not leaving me, I'm going with you, and I will bring you back. Now what's the problem? Why would he say, "Don't be afraid to go down to Egypt"? What would be the fear? Well, there was a lot to fear. When you think about taking your group of people that God's supposed to make into a special people and go into this larger nation, this larger culture with its fancy things and formal society and big temples and all this power, it can easily be thought, and this has happened to a lot of people groups, that they just become assimilated into the larger group. That they just sort of, their own little culture disappears and they adopt the new languages and the new ways and they just sort of be absorbed and disappear. And he's a little worried about that, I imagine. Egypt wasn't the promised land, so were they going to lose God's protection? Were they going to lose his provision? Were they going to lose the promise if they leave the promised land? And he assures him, you're not, just because you're leaving Canaan, just because you're stepping out of this geographical location, it doesn't mean you're leaving the promise. And it certainly doesn't mean that you're leaving me or that I'm leaving you. And I find this interesting because we're all Christians, right? So if I said, if you go to a foreign country, God goes with you, and we would all go, duh, of course, right? But I've been amazed. I mentioned this before. I was part of Pepperdine's Heidelberg program. And I was amazed at these very seemingly faithful Christians. My freshman year at Pepperdine, when we got over to Heidelberg, suddenly quit going to church. Suddenly didn't pray as often. Suddenly didn't attend the Bible studies or the devotionals. That suddenly in Germany somehow God wasn't there. Oh, they would never say that. But their behavior showed that. And just as amazingly, when we returned to Malibu, they were at church every Sunday, showed right back up and sang all the right songs. That there's an easy sort of mindset that somehow God is located here but not over here. And the fact of the matter is, some of us even struggle with that. We sort of put on that nice Christian aura when we step into the church building. We have this idea that God is somehow confined in these walls, and that he doesn't go home with us, and he doesn't go to work with us. So yeah, Jacob's got a lot to fear. And God's reassuring him, just because you're in a different geographical location, just because you're in a different place, maybe there's no altars that you built to worship me, that doesn't mean I won't be there, that I'm not a part of that place. I mentioned the other lesson I learned from the Kenyans. I remember the time they said, "Jolliff, why are you here?" I said, "Because God sent me here." And he said, "No, he did not." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "God did not send you here, he brought you here. He was already here." And I realized he was right. There's no place we go that God is not already there. Our job is to figure out what he's doing and join him in the process. God had a purpose for the Israelites in Egypt, and he was going with them, and he would bring them back. God is still God. God is still in charge in any geographical location. And he's always way ahead of us. When Pharaoh calls you and says, "What is your occupation?" Joseph's talking to his brothers. He said, "Your servants have been keepers of livestock from our youth, even until now, both we and our fathers, in order that you may dwell in the land of Goshen, for every shepherd is an abomination to the Egyptians." Egyptians were farmers. They didn't like, even in the Old West, you see the combat between farmers and the cattlemen. There was this natural conflict. Pasture lands require lots. If you're running livestock, you need lots of open ground. And if you're a farmer who's planted lots of fields and a bunch of cows walk through it, it kind of ticks you off. And they just sort of, there's this natural enmity between farmers and livestock people. Well, the Egyptians were farmers, depended on the Nile. And so here came shepherds, and they knew that shepherds were an abomination to the Egyptians. So how do you send the Israelites down to Egypt without them becoming assimilated? Without them getting sucked into the larger culture? Well, you give them an occupation that's an abomination to the locals. You see, no Egyptian would ever marry or intermarry with someone related to shepherds. All right, that's one of those little things I didn't see until I started reading through this particular study. But God was way ahead here. He knew how to keep his people in Egypt, but not of Egypt. How to keep them separate through a long, long stay. Then you have this other interesting scene. It's just a few lines, but there's a lot going on here. Joseph brought his father in to present him before Pharaoh, and Jacob blessed Pharaoh. And you could think, well, that's nice. But think about this. This is a 130-year-old guy stepping into the court of Pharaoh, the most powerful person in the world at that time. And Jacob blesses Pharaoh. Usually it went the other way around. Usually you walked into the king to get a blessing, to get a favor, to get something. and Jacob walks in and asks for nothing, he blesses Pharaoh. He presents him to court, but the fact is Jacob's holding court with Pharaoh. Jacob is the child of the promise. Jacob is the one whom God has blessed. And so Jacob blesses Pharaoh, the king, which I find really fascinating. And he does it twice in this passage. And he explains, my years have been few and difficult. And they don't equal my father. Jacob sort of lets Pharaoh know, I'm a part of something that's much bigger than I am. And then he blesses him again. But Jacob is actually presented as the one in the power position, in spite of the fact that he's standing in Pharaoh's court. Jacob is the one who blesses, not gets blessed. He doesn't seek a favor, he gives one. And you start to see this interesting dynamic between the promise and the empire of Egypt. Pharaoh tells Joseph the entire land is at your disposal. Here are the shepherds, the abomination, the small group of people, and Pharaoh says the whole land is open before you. Take the best of the land. That's not usually how you would treat foreigners who had an occupation that you didn't particularly care for. Pharaoh tells them, choose any land you want, any materials you need. I love that last passage. He said, don't even tell them not to even bring their possessions, because whatever we've got, it's theirs. That the whole empire was at the disposal of the Israelites. The empire was blessed because of the promise. This whole famine relief that Egypt was enjoying was because God had a plan for his people. And the entire nation and all the nations around Egypt were being blessed as a result of the promise to Jacob and his descendants. And now the empire will serve the needs of the promise. I love this passage where he says, now the Israelites settled in Egypt and in the region of Goshen, and they acquired property there and were fruitful and increased greatly in number. That almost sounds like the beginning of Genesis, doesn't it? Be fruitful and multiply. And now God has taken them into a foreign country, given them the absolute best land where they are able to prosper. And he apparently blessed them, and they increased greatly in number, which right now seems like a blessing. About 400 years, it's going to become an issue, because they will continue to increase greatly in number. Then you have this final scene, and this is really important. When the time drew near for Israel to die, he called for his son Joseph and said to him, if I found favor in your eyes, put your hand under my thigh and promise me that you will show me kindness and faithfulness. Do not bury me in Egypt. But when I rest with my fathers, carry me out of Egypt and bury me where they are buried. I will do as you say. And he said, swear to me. And then Joseph swore to him, and Israel worshipped and leaned on top of his staff. I find this just fascinating, because Jacob is in Israel. They're enjoying the blessings of the land. They've settled in a great place. It would be easy to get comfortable. It would be easy to say, we've got a privileged position here. Let's just settle down and become a part of this. Everything's good water, good pasture lands, good place to grow. We've got favor with the king. We're in a good place. Let's get settled. But he calls Joseph in and says, do not bury me here. This is not home. This is not the promised land. And so when I die, I want you to agree to take me back and bury me with my fathers. Why would he do that? He was giving him a vivid reminder. This isn't the promised land. This is good. We're here because God put us here. We're going to be here for a while. But this isn't it. This isn't the destination. So bury me back where my fathers are buried, as a reminder that the day will come when we go to the destination. Don't get totally comfortable. Live here, enjoy the land, be fruitful and multiply, marry and be given in marriage, but don't get too comfortable, because this isn't home. I find it interesting. He's able to, they had a thing about being buried with your ancestors. And so by insisting that Joseph take him back that even from the grave, he would call his people home. That the whole time the Israelite nation grew and identified with the founding father, Israel, the kids would say, well, where is he buried? And they would have to explain, not here. He's buried back home, where we're supposed to be. And that even from the grave, he continued to call them. Now, where's the gospel in this story? New Testament has a lot to say about Jacob and others like him. These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. As it is, they desired a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. See, Jacob recognized that Egypt wasn't it, that this was a journey, that life is a journey, and that even as he knew it wasn't it, he knew he would die here. God told him, your own son will close your eyes. You're going to die here, but he says, don't bury me here, because I want everyone to remember this isn't it. We're just passing through. Hebrews brings that out, that all of these guys, he didn't see the promise. I mean, here you had Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that were all promised Canaan. And when this story of Genesis ends, they're not even in Canaan. None of them received the promise. None of them saw the end. They had the promise, they lived the promise, but they didn't quite get the fulfillment of the promise. And Hebrews acknowledges what great faith that takes, to recognize they're part of something that's much bigger than they are, something that's ongoing, and that they're just part of the process. But that they have faith that whether they see the end of it or not, that their descendants will, that God will keep his promise. He will come through. And that we need to remember we're just on the journey towards that end. Peter says something similar. Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles, some versions say aliens and strangers, to abstain from the passions of the flesh which wage war against your soul. Don't be assimilated into the culture. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation. You see, Jacob was dealing with this, but then this is an ongoing problem. It's awfully easy for God's people to start to look like everybody else. It's awfully easy to allow ourselves to be assimilated into the larger culture, into the larger society. It's incredibly easy for our language to start to sound like everybody else's language. That our holiness turns into the profane, the common. And in the magazines that I read, and the research that is done, one of the biggest problems Christians have in America, when they interview people who are not Christians and ask them, what do you think about Christians? The number one thing they say is, I don't get the advantage because I don't see any difference. That when people from outside the church look at us, they can't tell there's anything different. They don't hear us talk different. They don't hear us budget different. They don't hear us interchange with our neighbors different. They don't hear us practice our business practices different. That when we're called to be a holy nation, a people for God's own choosing, we are called to be unusual. We're called to be a little strange. We're called to be sort of unique. And there's this tremendous pressure to blend in. Our advertising is aimed at it. Our culture is aimed at it. But there's this phenomenal pressure on us to just be like everybody else. And that is not what we're called to do. But like Jacob, we have to be worried. We need to be concerned. We need to focus on not assimilating into the larger culture. We need to remember, even on weekends like Memorial Day, that we are Christian Americans, not American Christians. That we have an allegiance that goes beyond our nation. That we owe our loyalty to something that's way bigger than we are. And that we are part of something that is way bigger than even the United States of America. And that we need to act like it. We need to sound like it. We need to plan like it. So let me encourage you this week that when you run into people, try to display your Christian heritage a little more than maybe your American heritage. And don't try to blend in. Try to stand out for God. I was in Home Depot yesterday. Interacted with one of the store people. We were looking for something. Couldn't find it. But as I turned around to leave, he said, "Have a blessed day." And I turned around and I said, as a minister, it's really great to hear that. We need to talk different. And right away, I could tell this man's a Christian just by his language. And I hope people can tell that we're Christians by our language and not that they can tell we're Americans just like everyone else by our language. Let's try to remember that this week, to be willing to be unique, to be willing to be holy, strange, unusual, so that God will be glorified in our lives. If you have any needs this morning, please come as we stand and sing.
This world is not my home.